So thank you all for joining us. It is gratifying to see a good and growing turnout. I think we had over 70 folks registered, which of course not everyone's gonna join, but we're really happy to see a lot of interest in this. And we're grateful to all of you for making the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I want to first point out that this training has been made possible with support from the U.S. Department of Energy State and Community Energy Programs Office. And I'll say that the reason for this training is twofold. First is the practical matter that transmission planning is a core element and requirement of the state energy program, which is every state energy office's bread and butter, as we say. And secondly, there's a recognition that greater engagement of state energy offices in transmission planning provides opportunities for states to meet the combined challenges that we are all facing. Those challenges being growing electricity demand, aging grid infrastructure, and the need to ensure resilience, reliability, and affordability. So what we hope that you all will get out of today's training is a strong understanding of transmission fundamentals, practical insights from state energy offices that have successfully engaged in transmission planning, actionable ideas to enhance your state's participation in state level and regional transmission discussions, and strengthen connections with peers from across the country who are leading innovative approaches to transmission planning in their respective regions. Next slide, please. So in terms of an agenda overview, I know it's a big afternoon, but we promise you it's going to be exciting. So there are going to be two fundamental parts of the agenda. The first is going to be the transmission planning fundamentals, which will be sort of a deeper dive into sort of all the basics. And then the rest of the training will be focused on state action planning, so where you will hear from your peers from other states. So we'll start with the transmission planning fundamentals, then we'll have examples of state energy office engagement in transmission planning from Massachusetts, Maine, and Utah. Then there will be a break between 2:45 and 3. So we recognize this is a big chunk of time. So if you could take your break during that time, that would be best, because you won't want to miss these other portions. Then there will be at 3 o'clock roles and opportunities of state transmission authorities, and we'll hear from North Dakota, New Mexico, and Colorado, each of whom has a transmission authority. And then finally, we will close our discussion with a session on opportunities for engagement in regional planning. So we'll hear from New Mexico, Wyoming, and then we'll hear from two regional efforts, the Western Interstate Energy Board and CREPC, and then a representative from the Tennessee Valley Authority and CERTEP. So we hope that that will be a really engaging afternoon and a lot of learning opportunities. Next slide, please. So you'll notice that we decided we were intentional about not having a webinar format. We wanted it to be a meeting format because we are really eagerly, we're really interested in hearing from you and having engaged discussion. So we will be recording the presentation portions of this training, but not the discussion portion. So we don't want you all to feel like you're on camera and being recorded. We want to have a free-flowing discussion. We'll have about 15 minutes following each of the 4 sessions for discussion and Q&A. And I said that we will not be recording that part. During that time, we would really encourage you all to, if you're comfortable, get on camera and off mute to engage in discussions and ask questions or share your own experiences. And if you're not comfortable with that, you can always use the chat function. We will be monitoring that as well. Next slide, please. So I'd like to kick things off by introducing our first speaker. Amy Rose serves as Transmission Group Manager with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Several of you may have had the pleasure to work with her before. She's a fantastic resource on this topic and will provide a comprehensive overview of transmission planning fundamentals, including key players, market structures, cost allocation considerations, and emerging federal and regional requirements. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Amy. Take it away, Amy.
All right, thank you, Catherine, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining what I think will be an interesting day of discussions. So before we go into the panel sessions to hear from our state experts, as Catherine mentioned, I've been asked to lay the groundwork with a high-level overview of transmission planning and some of the key topics in this space that are relevant for states. Next slide, please. So we'll start with an overview of transmission planning. What are the goals? What drives the need for transmission? Some of the unique features of transmission that influence planning. And then we'll talk about the different types of transmission investments, which entities are responsible for planning and building those investments in the US, as well as some of the potential roles for states. Third, we'll cover the always contentious topic of transmission cost allocation, or who has to pay for transmission, and touch on why this topic is so challenging and how regions are currently addressing it. And then finally, I'll provide an overview of the changes introduced in FERC Order 1920 last year and how this order might influence how we plan and what we plan. But first, we are going to start with a group poll to give me and all of you a sense of who you are and what you're hoping to learn today. So you will see 2 questions pop up on your screen. Please take a moment to answer those. And Camille, will we be able to see the live results as they come in? Great.
Yep, I guess we'll let a couple more people answer and then I'll go ahead and end this first question.
Okay, so largely we have a background in public policy, a few engineers, some economists. Great.
And then I will put up the second question. Is everyone able to see this one? Okay.
We see that people answered it, but maybe not what the answers are.
Oh no.
That's okay.
Oh,
Oh, here we go.
You're able to see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So you can see kind of what everyone's interested in learning about today, largely transmission planning, state roles, state initiatives, engagement. Great. Well, we will keep that in mind as we proceed with the day. But we can go back to the next slide now. Thanks.
Oops.
So we'll start with jumping into the overview of transmission planning. You can go ahead, Camille. Thanks. So the goal of transmission planning is to ensure a reliable and affordable power grid by proactively and cost-effectively building out necessary transmission infrastructure. Some regions also have goals related to achieving policy goals or generator interconnection, but first and foremost, transmission planning is about ensuring you have the grid infrastructure in place to reliably and cost-effectively meet demand. Next slide. And there are a lot of factors that drive the need for new transmission infrastructure. These change over time as technologies change and there's larger macroeconomic conditions changing in the country. But right now, the 5 biggest drivers for transmission include changes in the resource mix. As we deploy new generation resources in areas where we have not historically built generation, we also need to expand the grid to be able to move power from those areas to where the consumers are. Aging infrastructure is another big driver. A large share of our grid is 30, 40, 50 years old at this point, It has reached or will soon be reaching the end of its operational life and will need to be replaced. Demand growth is a big one we've been hearing about in the last year, especially large-scale demand growth driven by new data centers. But there's also demand growth driven by ongoing electrification of other sectors, like the shift among consumers to electric vehicles or electric heat pumps for heating and cooling. Extreme events. So transmission can help mitigate the impacts of extreme events by moving power from areas that may have a surplus to areas that might be experiencing a heat wave or a cold snap or a major storm that disrupts supplies. And then finally, distributed resources are shifting the patterns of energy demand and may require reinforcements at the transmission level to ensure both grid reliability, but also that we could fully utilize the distributed energy that's generated. Out of these 5 drivers, I would say right now, the changing resource mix and growing and shifting electricity demand are the biggest drivers for transmission investments. Next slide. So I'm thinking about how we could grow our transmission grid. It's helpful to kind of look how we've done it historically, which is largely in kind of phases of large scale expansion. So first after the World War I and World War II in the 1940s, but then in the 1960s, we saw one of the biggest growth periods in US history with more transmission networks expanded in the East and the West, and also the meshed grids on the East and the West Coast. So interconnecting grids that were already existing. Since that period, we've just seen small bits of transmission expansion and transmission network modernization as newer technologies became available. But with the exception of the Texas CREZ projects around 2013, large-scale expansion of the transmission grid has been relatively flat or even declining in recent years. So as a result, the current grid is aging. We need to replace our current infrastructure on top of meeting the expansion needs driven by load growth and generator additions. So this is a big investment challenge that needs to be met with both speed and scale, which probably seems very daunting right now, that we could achieve both speed and scale given our recent investment numbers, but it's possible. We have done this kind of large scale expansion before. And next slide. And it's also notable that there is growing interest in transmission planning as a concept. There are a lot of different metrics to show this. Here, I just went with a simple result based on Google Trends and internet search results. So as you can see, interest in transmission planning is relatively flat for most of the last 15 years, but it started to pick up dramatically over the last 5 years. This could be due in part to recent FERC action on transmission planning or driven by increased awareness of the need for transmission. But either way, people are thinking about this topic and talking about this topic a lot more, which is encouraging. Next slide. So before we dive into how transmission is planned in the US, it's worth pointing out some of the properties that impact both planning and design. First, we only have a discrete set of investment options when it comes to building transmission. These facilities can't be freely designed to meet the exact specifications of a particular area because we only have a handful of standard voltage levels and configurations to choose from, and we can't build just partial lines. Second, there are large economies of scale in transmission. Per unit line cost increased linearly with the line's voltage, but the transfer capacity, the amount of power that could be carried over a line, grows approximately with the voltage squared. So this means it's more economic to add transfer capacity in large increments rather than building out the network continuously. And I'm just speaking about the technical characteristics of the line. This also holds true for siting and permitting processes. I'm not a developer, but I would guess they would much rather go through the approvals one time for kind of a bigger project than once a year for incremental additions. So as a result, transmission investments tend to be overbuilt for the existing need, and new lines might not be fully used for several years. And this becomes important when deciding who has to pay for the line, since the full benefits of the line might not be realized for many years, but we need to start paying for the cost of the line now. And then finally, the laws of physics that govern power flows mean there is no fixed definition of transfer capacity across the network. Without going into the full physics lesson, it means, every time you add a line to a network, it could impact the carrying capacity of all the other lines on that network. So this implies there's a strong need for coordination among transmission owners during the planning process, which could be difficult. So with that background, let's move on, Camille, to how transmission is planned and built in the US. You can go to the next slide. So there are different types of transmission investments. For the purposes of this discussion, I've divided them broadly into local, regional, and interregional transmission. Local transmission is designed to meet the needs of a single utility service area. These projects can be lower voltage or shorter distances because the geographic scale is typically smaller. Regional projects are designed to meet the needs of a multi-state or multi-utility region. Think MISO or PJM. And these projects are designed to meet reliability needs, but could also be designed for economic reasons, to reduce congestion or facilitate generator interconnection. And interregional projects connect different regions, which are primarily designed to reduce costs or improve reliability by allowing resource sharing between regions over a larger geographic area. So next slide. Before I go into each of these in more detail, I want to pause quickly to check with you all. What do you think the primary type of transmission being built in the US is? Local, regional, or interregional? And take a few seconds to answer that question that pops up, and then we'll look at the results.
Are you able to see the results?
I don't see the results. I don't
Oh,
know if others
no.
do. Maybe you could just tell us what people thought.
Yeah. So local had the majority of votes with 24 out of 37. Regional had 9 out of 37, and interregional had 4 out of 37.
All right, great. Smart group. It is local. That we mostly build local projects. It's hard to find exact numbers, but more than half of the transmission built in the US is based on local utility criteria without going through the regional planning process. The rest is mostly regional. We build very little interregional transmission. Thanks, Camille. We can go to the next slide. So the planning for local transmission can look different depending on whether you're in an RTO or ISO or not. So within an RTO ISO region, the transmission owners or utilities identify the transmission need, plan the transmission, and submit that plan to the RTO, who can include it in the regional plan. The individual utility company can build the project, and then the process is overseen by the RTO and FERC as part of the regional planning process. Outside of the RTO regions, the utilities plan the project, they can build the project, and then the State Public Utility Commission, or PUC, oversees it. FERC also gets involved with oversight if there's interstate lines involved. And an example of a local project would be a new line to serve a growing customer base in a city or to replace an aging asset in a specific neighborhood. Next slide. Regional projects, also differ depending on whether you're in an RTO ISO region or not. And of course, ERCOT in Texas is always its own kind of different animal, so it has its own category here. But within an RTO, the RTO or ISO plans the project based on regional transmission needs. The project goes out for competitive bidding and is developed by member utilities or independent transmission companies, and then FERC oversees the regional planning process. In non-RTO ISO regions, regional projects are developed through voluntary coordination among the utilities. There are a lot of examples of these types of projects or planning groups. Some you're going to hear about later today, including West Connect or SCRTP in the Southeast. But the projects are developed by utilities or independent developers, and then the process is overseen by the state PUCs, where the projects are being developed, or FERC, again, if there's interstate lines involved. In ERCOT, ERCOT does the planning, and the utilities or independent developers develop the projects. ERCOT is famously not under FERC jurisdiction, and so oversight lies just with the PUC of Texas. And an example of a regional project would be building a new transmission corridor to connect a new generation plant that could serve load across a multi-state or multi-utility footprint. Next slide. And finally, interregional transmission. I saved the simplest table here for the most complex type of project that we try to build. So these are planned by neighboring RTOs or non-RTO utilities. The projects are developed by utilities or independent developers and overseen by FERC. An example of an interregional project would be connecting an RTO in the Midwest to one in the East to allow generators in the middle of the country to sell their power to load on the East Coast, for example. Next slide. So there weren't a lot of state entities listed in those last 3 slides, but there are actually several ways that state policymakers and state regulations impact transmission development across all of these categories. You'll hear more about it as the day continues, but I wanted to highlight some here. So first, state legislation related to energy requirements can drive the need for transmission. If the states pass laws that influence energy demand or investments in generation, the utilities and RTOs need to plan for this, and it becomes an input to the planning process. Second, state legislatures can pass laws that influence the planning process itself. So an example would be laws on project review or an approval processes that would then be implemented by the state PUC. Third, state and local governments can pass laws related to project siting and land use that developers need to comply with. So again, I'm not a developer, but from what I hear, siting and permitting is where these folks spend a large share of their time and resources getting a project built. So the laws related to siting and land use can have a large impact on transmission development outcomes. And then finally, state agencies such as transmission authorities could be authorized to support project development in a number of different ways. And we have some great representatives coming up later today that will speak on this and share their experience and lessons learned working through these entities and with these entities. Next slide. But I wanted to share one specific example of state action that's influencing transmission development. And this is related to federal rights of first refusal. A fairly esoteric topic, but in general, this right gives incumbent utilities the option to build, maintain, and own a transmission line in their service territory before the project is open to competitive bidding. So in the lingo of my elementary school kids, it means the incumbent utility has dibs to build the new project. So FERC Order 1000 eliminated federal rights of first refusal and opened projects to competitive bidding. Order 1920 looked at revising this because there were concerns that incumbents don't want to go through all the work identifying a transmission need, planning a project, if they're just going to lose out on developing the project when it gets open to competition. But ultimately, FERC left it as is, so there's no federal rights of first refusal. However, individual states are taking action on this in an effort to encourage more transmission development. So 12 states have enacted federal rights, rights of first refusal laws. And in 2023, which is the last year I have information for, 7 states were considering rights of first refusal legislation. So the map on the right shows states that have these laws in place. The actual laws look slightly different in each state, But in general, they grant rights of first refusal to incumbent utilities for local projects, meaning if the line's only going to be connected to facilities within that utility's service territory. And if it connects to other utilities, there are different laws that have been passed related to shared rights. There are also variations related to giving incumbents a window in which they could build the project, after which it gets open to competition. And in some cases, like in Indiana, these rights are extended to interregional transmission. So this is one way in which states are taking direct action to influence project planning and development. Next slide. All right, another big topic for transmission development. It's not actually related to the planning process itself, but still manages to heavily influence our ability to build new projects, and that is transmission cost allocation. Next slide. So transmission cost allocation refers to how the cost for building new transmission infrastructure are divided among project beneficiaries. Beneficiary pays or assigning cost to those who benefit from the project is the best method conceptually. A parallel version of this is called cost causality, or assigning cost to those who cause the line to be needed. But the challenge is that there is no undisputed way to define and measure transmission benefits. The last I checked from researchers, utilities, think tanks, they've identified more than 30 potential benefits that transmission could provide. Not all of these can be easily quantified, much less monetized. And for those that can be quantified, something like production cost savings, the results are really sensitive to the modeling assumptions and the scenarios you choose to run. And on top of that, the benefits and the beneficiaries are going to change over the 40-year lifetime of a transmission project. So given all the recognized challenges with trying to assign cost based on quantified benefits, most regions use network usage as a proxy for benefits. Here again, we immediately run into challenges because you cannot directly measure how much each user uses the network. We can't kind of paint the backs of electrons and watch which ones we use. So most regions use energy use or contribution to peak load to capture network use. And in a well-developed network, that could be fine. This is also called a postage stamp method. A major shortcoming of allocating cost using this type of method is that the charges don't actually reflect network conditions or send any locational signals. So a generator or a large load that chooses to build in a highly congested area would be charged the same as if they chose to build in another area that doesn't contribute to network congestion. And similar to benefits, network usage, however it's measured, it's going to change over the lifetime of a project. And so the challenge of transmission cost allocation is that there is no undisputed approach to assigning project cost, but these costs matter. And they can directly be reflected in energy prices and ratepayer bills. So as one example, the chart on the right shows some data from FERC on the contributions of different types of costs to wholesale prices in different regions from 2019 to 2022. That light blue color is the contribution from transmission costs. So in most of these regions, transmission costs account for more than 20% of the wholesale power cost over this period. Anecdotally, I hear the share has only gotten higher, but I haven't been able to find more recent data on this to confirm. Next slide. So FERC does not prescribe a particular cost allocation method. Instead, the Commission has provided some high-level principles in Order 1000 that were later reduced to 5 principles in Order 1920. Otherwise, regions have discretion to design cost allocation methods suited to their local preferences and system conditions. And this has led to quite a bit of variation in methods that are used, and also, as you can imagine, a fair amount of legal disputes. And these disputes tend to center around the need to balance precision with practicality. The overall message from FERC and from the courts is that the method needs to be detailed enough to ensure that costs are allocated to project beneficiaries, but also feasible to implement in a real system, given all the uncertainties about the future grid. So this tension between precision and practicality, it appears throughout our legal disputes in relation to trying to identify project beneficiaries and also quantifying project costs and benefits. So here we've kind of outlined some of the main takeaways from big court cases around transmission cost allocation. The method needs to be able to identify beneficiaries, and the cost allocation decision needs to be accompanied by evidence and explanation. So that's more on the precision side. And while all the beneficiaries need to pay according to the courts, they've also allowed some external free ridership to be permissible in order to balance regulatory goals. They've also allowed some leniency in the estimation of costs and benefits. There's a quote from the Seventh Circuit that benefits don't have to be measured down to the last penny, or for that matter, the last million or 10 million or perhaps $100 million for the purpose of cost allocation, so long as there's more than no benefits. So while we have to identify beneficiaries and have a clear method with evidence, it doesn't have to be exact. And then finally, the courts have ruled that there are some investments with broad scale benefits in which the cost could just be spread across all the users in a region or service territory. Next slide. So before I go into specifics of what different regions are doing on cost allocation, I'm going to check in with you again on what you think the most common approach for cost allocation for regional transmission projects is in the US. So Camille, we'll give people a couple more seconds and then show the results.
Will do. Are you able to see it?
Yep.
Okay.
So
awesome.
beneficiary-based methods. I see usage-based. All right, thanks. Well, let's take a look. So this chart, and there's a lot here, so we'll talk through it slowly, but it summarizes the approaches used in different RTOs and ISOs for different types of transmission project. Now, across these 7 regions, they have more than 24 categories of transmission projects and more than 20 different cost allocation methods. So I've taken some liberties here to simplify them for the purposes of comparison into 6 types of transmission across the columns at the top, and then roughly 5 types of cost allocation methods or approaches represented by these different colors. And the squares with multiple colors indicate that the region uses a blend of different methods. So what do we learn from this kind of comparison? First, on the far left, we see most local projects are largely cost allocated using what we've termed here a place-based approach. This is also called license plate type approach, where wherever the project is built, that utility is responsible for allocating costs among its load. So the thought here is with local projects is that local projects, they tend to be smaller with more localized impacts and benefits. And so the users within that service area should cover the cost. The second trend is that generator interconnection projects are almost exclusively paid for by a particular type of network user. So it's not based on how much you use the network or where you're located, but who are you? And in this case, it's the interconnecting generator. So this is the yellow column mostly. MISO and ERCOT, those are exceptions where MISO assigns 10% of the cost across the region based on a load ratio share. And in ERCOT, they kind of have the reverse situation where most of the costs are allocated across the region, but the interconnecting generator has to pay some small equipment cost. A third trend is that usage-based methods in the blue color. These are the most common approach across regions and across project types that are used. So this is mostly implemented through a postage stamp method or allocating cost in proportion to load, either energy or peak load. PJM has a variation where they use power flow modeling and contributions to power flows to proxy network usage. Fourth, direct cost allocation based on quantified benefits or cost causality is very rarely used, and that's the green color. MISO and New York ISO, they blend quantified benefits and a postage stamp method by, for example, quantifying the benefits to identify which zones within their larger region are benefiting from a project, but then the cost within those zones are allocated based on load ratio share. PJM's tariff includes a method for multi-value projects where the cost causer for each value, kind of each driver for that project would pay based on their contribution to the need. But this hasn't actually been used in practice yet that I'm aware of. And then finally, even when regions use the same method, they have very different ways of implementing it. So I mentioned that all 7 regions use a load ratio share or postage stamp method to proxy network usage. But they have 7 different ways of implementing this and defining load ratio share. Some are based on energy, some are based on peak load, some look at the 3 highest load months of the year or just a single highest demand day of the year. So there's a lots of variation in how this is implemented. Next slide. All right, and finally, I'm going to spend a few minutes looking ahead to how we could expect transmission planning to change as a result of FERC Order 1920. Next slide. As a little background, this order, officially called Building for the Future through Electric Regional Transmission Planning and Cost Allocation, it came out in May of 2024, followed by 1920A and 1920B after request for rehearing. And the motivation for the order was that Order 1000 wasn't adequate. It didn't require transmission providers to look out at a long enough planning horizon to assess their transmission needs. It didn't require them to account for all the different things that could be driving the need for transmission. And they didn't have to consider a broad range of benefits that transmission could provide. So as a result, FERC concluded, we were mostly planning local projects. The planning process itself wasn't always transparent, and states didn't always have clear opportunities to participate in the process. Next slide. So one final check for you all, which is, can you name 1 to 2 of the key reforms introduced in 1920? All right, Camille, do we have some responses coming in?
Yep, I was gonna let a couple more trickle in.
Okay.
Looks like we should be good. I know
All right.
the word cloud might be kind of hard, so maybe I can scroll through some of these.
I think we can see is gets the 20-year planning horizon, the 7 factors. I see states involved, state participation. Yep, great. Well, let's looks like you all are very well versed in 1920, and it was a lot in there, thousands of pages. So in the interest of brevity, I'm going to try to distill the updates into 2 slides and 2 categories related to changes in how we plan and changes in what we plan. So first on how we plan. The Commission outlined specific requirements for regional long-term planning, including some of the things that were just mentioned. So a required planning horizon of 20 years, requirements to evaluate at least 3 scenarios and 1 extreme event, a list of 7 factors that need to be included as possible drivers for transmission needs. So this order was far more prescriptive than Order 1000 to address what the Commission saw as necessary practices that were not taking place. It also required the development of processes and criteria to select transmission facilities. Notably, it doesn't require any projects to be selected, but the processes have to be in place for selection to take place. And then finally, there are a number of areas where the order included a bigger role for relevant state entities, including on the design of the planning scenarios, developing the input assumptions that would be used in the modeling, designing the selection criteria, and on cost allocation methods. Next slide. And in terms of what to plan, there were 3 kind of new things included here. First is the consideration of interconnection related transmission needs. So these are needs that have been identified in multiple planning cycles, but these projects were just not being developed. It doesn't seem like they're going to be developed because of the project cost. So there's a part in the order to and as well as criteria to include those needs in long-term planning. Second is consideration of transmission alternatives for both new and existing facilities. This came up in the word cloud, so I know some of you are familiar with this. So this includes advanced conductors, power flow control devices, dynamic line ratings, and transmission switching. And for some of these, especially the last 3, this marks a departure from what's normally considered as part of planning, because these are more on the operational side. And then finally, consideration of local planning and right-size replacements of transmission facilities to help improve the coordination between local and regional planning, but also identify opportunities where maybe a local project needs to be replaced. Well, can we replace that project with a larger one that could also be used to meet regional needs? And I think that was my last slide. So thank you all. Huge thanks to Camille for running slides and doing the polls.